Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we're going to look at the weekly metagame breakdown for the Explorer format. We're going to focus on Explorer best of 3 for this video. We'll do best of 1 next week. Big kind of news for the format is first week of December, I believe December 9th, we are going to be getting the Pioneers Anthology Masters, whatever you want to call it, where Arena client's going to get an injection of cards that will pretty much bring us in par to the current Pioneer format. So Explorer will be pretty much there. I think they said within 99% of the playable cards that are seeing action right now. So things like the Lotus Field deck, Bring to Light, we should anticipate some of those cards coming to the format, which will be exciting. We got some cards in this last set with Foundations, things like Boros Charm that we are missing. So we're getting closer and closer every day to having Pioneer here on Arena. There was also the Canadian RC this weekend, which had a number of Rakdos Demon decks being played. That was probably the most prominent of the decks. Azorius combo had a good showing. I think the deck's not going to be played that much on Arena. Just it's extremely click intensive, and you're likely just going to run out of rope time in most cases. It's very much like a Paradox Engine style loop where you're going to have a hard time kind of executing it. My buddy and I were trying it, and it's not fun to like after the first kind of loop of the combo, you're like, cool, let's just move on from here. So we're just gonna look today. We're gonna start popularity of the deck day with Untapped GG stats. If you want to use Untapped, link is in the video description. You can track your win rates, all that cool stuff, and then I'll paste all these deck lists as well. Get going there. Starting off, Rakdos Demons is the most popular deck at 15%. Jund Sacrifice, which is the food combo, at 7. Control, blue-white Teferi, 6.3. Izzet Phoenix, kind of move up the dial. We see like Jund Azorius Phoenix being pretty much like the most played. There's not enough, there's only 1,800 games of Mythic Explorer played right now, so that's why we have the kind of filters in this manner. So we are going to look at 12,000 games for the last week, Platinum to Mythic rank. Highest win rate deck is Selesnya, Death and Taxes, Selesnya Company. YouTube algorithm doesn't like me saying this word, so we're going to call it Selesnya Company. This deck's got the real Llanowar 8 elf curve, 8 1-mana accelerants into just like a bunch of 3-drops. With Collected Company to kind of maximize your hits, 4 mana for Company to ideally give you 6 mana worth of spells, or when I collect Company, pay 4 mana, reveal the top 6 lines of your library, and then shuffle them and put them back to the bottom. This deck here is taxing your opponent, so like Peacekeeper can name a card, Emiria makes their lines come into play, limits the amount of spells they can play. Aven Interrupter is kind of a pseudo counterspell. Spellbinder is a tax effect. Enduring Innocence is card advantage. Removal and Skyclave Apparition, we're seeing a 1 of Tyvar. Indestructible Threat, that can be an anthem for your team, and then Werefox Bodyguard as more removal. You can also protect your own creature depending on how the game is. Like if you're playing against a control deck, you can put one of your creatures underneath it, so even if they sweep, you have some pressure afterwards. Thalia for tax, Kellen for card advantage, Dromoka's Command, flexible, could be removal, could be a fight spell, could deal with enchantments for say something like Enigmatic Incarnation or stuff of that nature. Sideboard, you have Portable Holes for removal, more commands, Graveyard Hate, even Mind Sensor, anything that's going to be tutoring, Enigmatic, stuff like that, you can get them that way there. Brutal Cathars, more removal, Spellbinder for tax, Katsuli's mainly for Graveyard Hate, more removal with Werefox, and then against heavy kind of removal-based decks, you can bring in the Wandering Emperor. So a lot of kind of flash style effects within the deck. This is the Jund food combo, 75%. So this deck here is basically red-black sacrifice with a infinite combo. You have Yurga in play, a cat in play, and then a cat in your graveyard. The cats themselves are food tokens, so they can sacrifice them to each other. Just create a loop, sack, bring it back, drain your opponent out. Scavenger's Talons all the modes are super relevant in this deck, helping you generate food tokens, milling yourself into the combo, and then reanimating for the combo. Otherwise, it's just like a Fable, Mayhem Devil, ping your opponent to death. Got some new art with the Deadly Dispute. Heartless Act is being played right now because there's an increase in the demon decks that are playing Archfiend Address, so it's the remove 3 counters could kind of force your opponent to lose the game that way there. Haywire Mites, Artifact Enchantment Hate, Hand Hate, cheap removal that exiles, Dampening Sphere for like Nykthos or Lotus Field decks, Ob basically for the control matchups, grindier matchups, and then Leyline for graveyard decks. Izzet Phoenix? So the Phoenix decks are at 71%. Majority are off Ledger Shredder now and instead playing Artist Talent. So this lets you draw, discard, loot. Non-creature spells cost 1 less, so kind of could reduce things like Treasure Cruise further, or like the Picklock Pranksters Free the Fates style effect. But the core of the deck is basically draw, discard, loot. So you get Phoenixes in your yard, cast 3 spells, get Phoenixes back, pay 1 mana to draw 3 cards with the Treasure Cruise style effects. Some bounce effects with like Brazen Boar, and then you're a little bit more all in on the Phoenix with this particular variant of the deck. Sideboards, cheap graveyard hate, artifact enchantment counters, so like Enigmatic, stuff like that. Cheap removal, some counters, alt win condition that you can just, if they are eating out your graveyard, you can just draw, discard through your deck, and then play Thassa's Oracle to win. Third Path as kind of a young pyromancer style effect. This is on non-creature as opposed to instants or sorceries, so things like your enchantments also would trigger it. Sweeper in Anger, Brazen Borer, again just to bounce like Rest in Peace, cheap hate pieces. Prismari can deal with a lot of hate pieces, and then Mystical Dispute as a cheap counter. Boros Burn, 69%. So base mono red, we're seeing Screaming Nemesis find its way into Pioneer and Explorer. This card's been spiking in price because of standard. We also get Eidolon in here. So whenever either player, so keep in mind this hurts you too, cast a spell 3 or less, it deals 2 damage to that player. So the goal is to kind of get ahead in terms of damage and then force it where your opponent can't cast. Boros Charm and Lightning Helix are some new additions to the deck. Your sideboards got Red Cap for the mirrors, Rending for blue-white decks. Deflecting Palm can kind of redirect large sums of damage. Get Lost, this cheap removal. Rest in Peace for graveyard hate. Anti-life gain, anything with a lot of ETB style effects. You can bring this in, works out nicely. Twisted Fealty to steal your opponent's big things. So similar, we have Gruul Aggro, also at 69%. Nice. So you have the Nemesis here. This has got a bit of the mouse package with Heartfire, Emberheart, 2 Manifold Mouse. Single copy of Questing Druid, the Innkeeper's Talent. Seeing things like Bushwhack as ways to kind of trigger the Nemesis here. Paw Patch Recruit in here, another way if things get targeted. Restless Rage can also work with the Screaming Nemesis to trigger it. So interesting kind of configuration change here of the deck itself. So no slick shots in this version, opting to go a little bit more with the mouse package, which we are kind of shifting to. We have Pick Your Poison, Artifact Enchantment Flyers, more Reckless Rages removal, protection, cheap removal options, Graveyard Hate, and then for the heavier removal options, you have Urbrass Forge and Hazard in the side. We go to Golgari Midrange, Golgari Demons, so kind of just an adaptation of your standard deck, so things like Unholy Annex in here, Archfiend, Slashers, Frillbacks, Glissas. Pretty much a lot of this is standard legal. You add the addition of Heartless Act, Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, and then incidentally, this card's been seeing a lot more play recently, Blade of Oni, 2 mana, 3/1. It's a equipment demon. So on its own, it's just a demon. It could curve you this into the Annex on turn 3, and then you get that gain and drain right away. It can also let you reconfigure and attach to a creature. So even like attaching it to the Menace or to the Slasher, it gives it Menace and base power changes. So some interesting lines there can be had. You also have Mutavault here, which you can activate to work with the Unholy Annex. Various kind of hand hates, cheap removals, turns off ETB effects, hand hate, sweepers, Shelly for the grindy matchups, Invoke Despair to kind of go over the top. Then have 5-color Incarnation. So this is Moneybags deck, but the core of this deck is using Enigmatic Incarnation to transform or to sacrifice and search. So you sack an enchantment and then you go kind of birthing pod into other things. You have all these overlords that you can sack to get value. So like Overlord of the Hauntwoods could find Overlord of the Boilerworks after it gets its effect. And you use the impending cost to kind of curve out that way. Leyline Binding can go get you Atraxa or Titan of Industry. You have these, so notably with the Sauna, Roaring Furnace, Steaming Sauna, I believe when it's in play, depending on what side of the room it's in, that's all that gets seen for. So on the stack, it's the cost. In your hand or reveal, it's both sides. I believe that's the case. I'm not 100% certain on that ruling. But just cheap removals. You got Beans that works nicely with the effects to give you card advantage. Very much toolboxy, so you can configure this as you like. Things like Path to the World Tree replaces itself by finding a basic land. Late game could be a mana sink, but as also something you could tutor to find one of your 3-drops. Cheap removal, Artifact Enchantment Hate for like the Mirror, more removal, Graveyard Hate, counters, heavy counter-based matchups. You have Chandra's and then Agent to steal stuff in the mid-range battles. So Rakdos Demons is at 63%, so very similar to the Golgari versions. You get Fable in here, 2 Shelly's main, Fear Missing Out, another way to draw a discard, kind of find your effects. So just a lot of ways to kind of grind out. This is just like the new adaptation of Rakdos Midrange. Basically, you can never kill this deck when you have Fable kind of mixed into here. Fable Thoughtseize Fatal Push is the core of like the entire Pioneer meta for like, no matter how many things they ban, it just keeps coming back in different iterations. Various hand discard effects, cheap removal. Hidasuku is good against like the food decks, low to the ground aggro decks. Path to Peril is a cheap sweeper. Leyline for Graveyard Hate, Invoke for the mid-range mirrors. Mono Green Devotion, 62%. So this has got a couple updates from the recent set. So we're seeing Toski in here. I would draw some cards. Indestructible. Notably, this is a special guest variant, so it's mythic, but you can just craft the rare one. So you probably already have a copy of it, depending on how long you've played. This version's got some Yorvos in here. So a little bit different build. Fewer Oakcaster Trailblazers. Copy of Loot being played here. And then Genesis Wave as kind of the big mana sink in addition to Storm the Festival. So you can kind of Genesis Wave, fill the board, but you also have the way with Uvenwald Oddity that you can transform it to give all your creatures haste for the turn. So you have, we're not on the Karn package anymore, so you actually play cards in your sideboard. Pick your poison, Artifact Enchantment Hate, Graveyard Hate, Life Gain, kind of cards off the top. Life Gain with Setestin, Arasta for like Phoenix, stuff like that. Baloth for heavy discard decks, Gargaroth for the aggressive decks, Counterspell, kind of heavy removal decks. You have Thrun, then Leveler for the and Ulamog for kind of the mid-rangey mirrors where it's going a little bit longer and you could just go over the top. Azorius Control, 59%. So pretty stock list. You have like the Farewells, notably no Lotus Field in this particular version. So you'll have things like Temporary Lockdown in the main, March, 3 steps ahead in here. So just a bunch of cheap counters. You have like Narset, Emperor, and Fairy as planeswalkers to accrue value. Wandering Emperor could be a win condition. And then you usually have things like Castle Ardenvale, Restless Anchorage, and Fountain Port as utility lands in the deck. Red-green hate, Graveyard Hate, aggressive decks. You have Knockout Blow, 1 mana removal that gains you life. Mystical Dispute for cheap counters. Mid-rangey aggressive decks, you have Beza to help stabilize. Burn or heavy discard decks, you have Leyline. Counterspell-based control mirrors, you have Sharp Typhoon and Hullbreaker. And lastly, we have Boros Tokens Creativity. This one's a cool one. 58%. So Indomitable Creativity, basically X target a number of tokens, and then you reveal till you find creatures from the top of your library. This version here is trying to go into Terror of Peaks and Overlord of the Mistmoors, so you can start pinging them to death or just get a lot of Mistmoors and kind of go wide like that. Make tokens with things like Wandering Emperor, Fable, you have Card Advantage Engine and Caretaker's Talent, bunch of cheap removal to kind of supplement it. Fountain Port makes you tokens as well. So kind of going in that route. Cheap removal, Phoenix matchups, anything that's trying to play prowess matchups, things that want to play a lot of spells per turn, you shut them off that way there. Graveyard Hate, Sunder the Gateway can be a way to create a token, but also it deals with artifacts or enchantments. Sunset Reveille for the aggressive decks, sweepers, and the mid-rangey mirrors where you want to move off creativity because they're going to have a lot of removal. You could kind of shift into like a Caretaker's Talent or a Brass Forge matchup, Chandra on the top end as well. This is it for the week. Let me know what you've been playing and what you're most excited about for the new cards coming in for Pioneer. Catch you next time. Thanks for